Good evening, everyone. So welcome to our 21 days Divine Principle Lecture. So we are now on ilang days nga?
9 po.
9 days. So welcome. So we are now on the chapter 6, which is Predestination. So last week, our topic is resurrection. So the essence in carrying out the providence of resurrection, kunting ano lang, is number one, we need God's words. Because without God's words, there is no resurrection. Number two, and God's words is God's responsibility. And number two, we need to believe and practice God's words. It is because without practicing and believing God's words, also, there is no resurrection. So these two should be present. No? So in order to accomplish God's will. So now we are on predestination. So predestination in Christian theology is the doctrine that all events are predestined by God or have been predestined by God. For example, prosperity and decline, happiness and misery, salvation and damnation, rise and fall of nations. And there are passages also that affirm predestination. And also there is passages that refute predestination. That's why here we can say theological controversy over predestination has caused great confusion in the religious lives of many people. So in the Bible, we find many passages which are often interpreted to mean that everything in an individual's life comes to pass exactly as predestined by God. So example, itong Romans chapter 8, verse 30. So ang sabi dito, he whom he predestined, he also called. And he whom he called, he also justified. And he whom he justified, he also glorified. At saka itong isa, Romans chapter 9, verse 15 to 16. Sabi dito, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So it is not man's with the one naman, sabi dito, has the potter nawala ba? Okay lang. So sabi dito, has the potter have the right over the clay? One to make out for the same lump. One vessel for beauty and the other for menial use. And in Romans chapter 9 verses 11 to 13, ang sabi dito, God loved Jacob more than Esau, even in mother's womb. And God said that the elder would serve the younger. So ito, nakikita natin, no, these Bible verses affirm predestination. But sabi din dito, yet we can find sufficient evidence in the Bible to refute the doctrine of absolute predestination. So dito, makikita natin in Genesis chapter 2 verse 17, ito in the Garden of Eden, God commanded Adam and Eve, no, not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For the moment you eat of it, you will surely die. So we can say that God, no, give this commandment to prevent Adam and Eve from falling. So the fall of man, no, is not God's predestination. So ito naman sa Genesis chapter 6, verse 6. Sabi dito, was sorry that He had created human beings, mankind. So, bakit mag-sorry si God kung ang predestination niya ay yung ma-fall yung tao? So, it is not God's predestination. Tapos in Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, sabi dito, seek and you will find, and knock and it will be open. So, dito makikita natin na it also involves human endeavors, no? Human efforts. So why God emphasized, no, human efforts, no? If only for God's predestination. Then in James chapter 5, verses 14 to 15, sabi dito, we should pray for our sick brothers. So sickness is not God's predestination. So makikita natin there are passages that affirm predestination. And also there are passages that refute predestination. So the question now is, how can the principle solve this problem? So dito in section 1, the predestination of God's will. So firstly, we need to define what is God's will. So according dito, God could not accomplish His purpose of creation due to the human fall. Accordingly, God's will is to accomplish the purpose of creation. In this sense, God's will is that restoration be accomplished. So God could not accomplish His purpose of creation due to the human fall. So in this sense, no, God's will is that restoration be accomplished, or the fulfillment of the purpose of the providence of the restoration. And God is the absolute being, unique, eternal, and unchanging. Therefore, His will also must be absolute, unique, eternal, and unchanging. So, yung nature ni God is absolute, unique, eternal, and unchanging. That's why His will also is the same, no? Absolute, unique, eternal, and unchanging. So that's why we can observe, no, when Adam and Eve fell. So God put Jesus Christ as the next Adam, no? Because His will is absolute. If the person failed to accomplish the mission, then he will find another person, no, to appropriate for that mission to replace that person. So when Jesus Christ also did not fulfill the will because of the disbelief of the people, and ultimately He was crucified. So Jesus Christ said in Matthew chapter 16, verse 27, that the Lord should surely come and fulfill the will without fail. So, kung makikita natin din sa history ng providence of restoration, during the time of Adam, no, right after nung fall nila, no, sa family niya, God wants to intended to establish, no, preparation in accepting the Messiah, centering on Cain and Abel. But because Cain killed Abel, so it ends in failure. So that's why God replaces Abel to Seth. Then also in Noah's family, so yung also nag-fail si Noah because of the failure of Ham, no? Then God replaces Noah with Abraham's family. And also in Moses' time, now when Moses also did not accomplish his will, then God replaces Moses with Joshua. So in Jesus' time also, when the disciple Judas betrayed Jesus, no, he was replaced by Matthias. So we can see that God's will is absolute. No, when the central person, no, failed to accomplish the will, so God will find another person, no, to replace that person. It is because God's predestination of His will is absolute. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you po, Kuya Julius. Yun, the definition of God's will is absolute. Now, ready na po ba kayo, brothers and sisters, sa section 2 ng lecture natin? Thank you, Kuya Julius. Okay. May mga katanungan po ba kayo sa sa unang lecture natin ngayong gabi? Brothers and sisters?
Mamaya na lang,
Mamaya na lang po.
tuloy-tuloy muna tapos pagtapos.
Okay po. Okay, so now let's welcome our second lecturer. This sister is also an HQ staff and part of UPTA. Ready na ba kayo? Let's welcome Ate Monina. Okay, sharing.
Good evening, brothers and sisters.
Okay. Habang naghihintay po tayo, meron po bang gusto kararating lang po ni Ate Janine. Welcome po, Ate Janine. Okay lang po sa mga iba nating brothers and sisters, okay lang po ba i-open niyo po yung camera niyo para namin makita natin yung mga magaganda at gwapo ninyong mga mukha. Thank you.
Okay na po ba? Nakikita ba ako?
Yung presentation mo, te?
Yung presentation niyo po, Ate Mon. How about si Kuya Crestruel? Okay lang po on natin yung camera natin.
Presentation.
And si Kuya Kiano rin.
Yo.
Okay, so once again, good evening, brothers and sisters. Okay na ako. Okay? So, dito, sa'yo. Sorry. Okay, good evening once again, brothers and sisters. So, bago ang lahat, mayroon akong ipapalabas. So, mayroon akong ipapalabas sa inyo na isang movie clip. Mixing movie clip lang po siya. So, para mas maipaliwanag natin at maintindihan pa natin lalo ang mga topic natin ngayon na predestination. Okay? So, panoorin natin sabay-sabay. Wait lang. Ate Jenny. Wala. Nasa Ate Jenny. What happened?
Gusto niyo mag-share?
Sino mag-play, te?
Ate Jen. Ate
Baka pa si
Jenny.
Jenny.
Hindi kasi nag-work sa laptop ko siya.
Yung technical.
Kaya ako na lang.
Technical problem. Charot. So, bali yung ano natin ngayon is, topic is section 2, the predestination of the way in which God's will is fulfilled. So, yun siya. Siya, doon sa Tijen. Ha? Wala pala yan. Sa Tijen. Sorry.
Ako na lang tayo mag-share.
Andiyan kaya. Close ko siya. Sorry po. Yun. Napanood yun na. So, bali, anong sabi ng babae? Walang mapapala ang walang ginagawa. So, yun siya. So, alam nyo ba ang kwento ng alamat na yan? Siguro sa inyo, familiar yata to sa inyo eh. Especially sa mga, yeah, I think sa mga bata, di ba, pinapalabas niya siya lagi. So, di ba, si Juan, na-predestin niya na nga ang prutas na yan is kainin niya. But, sa katamaran niya, naghintay pa siya ng bayabas yung lalapit sa kanya. Di ba? Ang galing talaga. So, ang galing talaga ni Juan. So, yun siya, brothers and sisters. Kahit hindi niya nagawa ang kanyang responsibility, kunin niya lang yung bayabas at huwag hayang mahulog sa puno. So, sa kanya lang kainin. So, napansin nyo, ang daming dumadating, di ba? Mga UFO, birds, engkantada, or iba pa, di ba? So, buti hindi siya kinuha at naging bato. Charot, naging ibang adar na sana siya. Joke lang. So, anyway, yung main lesson doon is to take our portion of responsibility. So, dapat ma-fulfill natin yung yung responsibility. Di ba ang dream lang talaga natin is yung desire natin ba nga makuha natin, di ba? So imagine, ito yung puno ng bayabas, tapos gawa ni God, gusto ni God na ibigay sa'yo lahat, pero hindi mo ginawa. So parang ganun siya, di ba? So, may kumuha na ang iba, nagalit pa si Juan. So, dapat hindi tayo magtamad-tamaran, so brothers and sisters. So, yun yung doon. So, gawin natin yung natin talaga, portion of responsibility. So, tama ba, brothers and sisters? So, okay, I will continue my topic for this time. Again. Okay. Chapter 6, Section 2, the predestination of the way in which God's will is fulfilled. Okay. So, according to the principle of creation, God's purpose of creation can be realized only when human beings complete their portion of responsibility. So, God predestined the process of its fulfillment conditionally contingent upon the 5% responsibility of the central figure, so which must be completed in addition to the 95% responsibility of God. Diba? God's purpose of creation was to be fulfilled through Adam and Eve only when they completed their given responsibility and refrained from eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So, 'di ba katulad sa yun nga sa yung tao, yung sa story niyang Jewish people, 'di ba? As the central nation of the providence should have believed in Jesus and followed him unconditionally in order for God to accomplish a complete salvation at that time. So, tingnan mo ang nang dahil hindi sila naniwala kay Jesus yung mga Jewish people. So, babalik ulit si Jesus. So, parang katulad lang yan ni Juan. So, nangyari kay Juan tamad kasi hinihintay niya pa yung yung bayabas, kinuha na ng ibang tao. So, maghintay ulit siya ng bayabas. So, ilang taon naman yung hintayin niya, yung pagtanim pa lang, di ba? Pagtanim pa lang, ilang taon na, tapos magbunga pa lang yan siya, ilang months na. So, nang dahil sa talaga ni Juan, hindi, yung liit ng responsibility niya, hindi niya lang talaga na-fulfill. So, to what extent does God predestine the unfolding of the events in the providence? So God predestined the process of the accomplishment conditionally. So, contingent upon the 5% responsibility of the central figure, which must be completed in addition to the 95% of God's responsibility. So, in the proportion of 95% is used to indicate that the human portion of responsibility is extremely small when compared to God's portion of responsibility. Yet, in human beings, this 5% is equivalent to 100% of effort. So, di ba si God, yun nga, sinabi ko earlier na nagawa si God, create niya ng mundo, tapos yung sa mga halaman, at the same time yung puno ng, sampo yung kay Juan Tamad, di ba? Hindi niya pa nagawa ang kay Tamad, kunin niya lang, di ba? Hindi niya pa nagawa-gawa. So, yun yung siya. So, ang kay God talaga nga part, ang hirap talaga gawin ng yung kay God nga part na 95%. So, but as a human fall, katulad kay Juan Tamad, dapat maging lesson sa kanya nga kunin niya lang yung gawin niya lang yung responsibility niya. So, to cite some example, God predestined that his will be fulfilled through Adam and Eve only when they refrained from eating the fruit and completed their responsibility. So, naniwala lang sana tayo kay God na hindi, yung sa ancestors natin na si Adam and Eve, kung naniwala pa lang na hindi kainin yung prutas, so wala sanang ngayon, yung parang yung story is repeating itself. So, in dispensation of restoration through Noah, God predestined that his will be fulfilled only after Noah completed his responsibility by exerting himself with utmost devotion in building the ark. Di ba alam niyo yung history ng Noah's Ark? Di ba yung sinabihan si Noah's Ark na magawa ka ng ark. So, parang dati si Noah pinagtawanan siya kasi sa 120 years niya nagawa yung ark, di ba? Tapos, doon pa siya nagawa doon sa bundok. So, kung isipin natin, di ba, si Noah kasi is na-fulfill niya yung responsibility niya. Nga, nag-obey lang siya kay God. Meron lang siyang belief ba kay God. Nga, magawa niya. So, yung time ng Noah na yun, na-fulfill niya yung responsibility niya. So, katulad ng yung example ko computer, example. If may magsabi sa'yo, okay, you can watch the computer, you can open anything, but set this up. Yung apps na to, bawal ka mag-open ito. Kasi if bubuksan mo to, na naman siya, mapatay, or magiging bigla siyang shutdown. So, kasi hindi tayo naniniwala, so dapat naniwala tayo kasi pag mapatay on the spot yung ng computer, so bili naman siya ulit. So, parang ganun lang, kasi parang katulad lang yung sa may-ari ng computer at saka si God. So, if naniwala tayo kay God, na hindi kainin yung fruits, diba? So, wala na tayo sa ngayon, yung percent na ito nga i-fulfill natin, diba? So, kung equivalent sa tao, sa atin, yung 5% of responsibility, super malaki na talaga yan siya. Super malaki na yan siya kung i-compare kay God, diba? Pero, God, grabe talaga yung talaga ni God. Yung heart niya talaga ba nga maging ma-accomplish yung will niya talaga. So, the predestination of the fulfillment of God's will is conditional. So, bali, ito yung so, the predestination of the fulfillment of God's will. Ay, naulit So, yun yung siya, di ba? Meron dito sa, and in, it is written in the Bible. So, di ba, meron nakatawag doon na, the prayer of faith will save the sick man. So, it means, if you pray and have faith, gagaling ka talaga, di ba? So, if your faith has made your will. So, if nagsalig ka talaga na ikaw ay gagaling, example, gagaling ka sa sakit mo, so maging ano ka talaga, maging, yun, gagaling ka. So, and for everyone who asks, who will receive. So, kung mag-ask ka or bibigyan ka, di ba? You can receive. Then, and he who seeks and it will find. So, kung mag-ano ka talaga, meron talagang way. Then, and to him who knocks, it will be open. So, kung ano ka talaga, you can ask somebody or knock, there's somebody to open you, like a door. Kung mag-ask ka, di ba, they will open. So, like that. So, yun yung siya, brothers and sisters. So, lastly, kasi ito lang yung, I have a quote, so, last, is a journey of 1,000 miles began with a single step. So everyone, we are important because God gave us responsibility to fulfill His will. So, yun siya, let's, brothers and sisters, let's do our best, especially to fulfill our individual portion of responsibility. So, that's it. Thank you so much. Hope.
Thank you po, Ate Marinia.
Yeah.
Wow, very detailed din yung lecture niyo po. With example and video pa talaga. So, okay ba, brothers and sisters? Nagustuhan niyo ba yung lecture ng mga naunang lecturers? Okay, now I will welcome the third lecturer for tonight. This one is our elder brother. Okay, without further ado, let's welcome Kuya Herwin.
It's Aterelina, right?
Ay, sorry.
Nagulat ako.
Hindi naman ba Kuya Herwin? Mali pala ako. Excited na ako. Sorry, Ate Relina. Actually, si Ate Relina pa pala. So, let's welcome Ate Relina.
Nagulat ako dun, ah. Joker pala yung MC natin ngayon.
Nakakatawa.
Sorry, nakamute ako. Tapos ayaw mag-share. Okay na? Good evening. Nadidinig ako?
Yes po, naririnig ko kayo ate.
Hello, good evening.
Sorry.
So in section 1, Kuya Julius explained na predestination of God's will is absolute. And that also, since the predestination of God's will is absolute, it will also be the same in the restoration. Kung ano yung predestination, kasi di ba, yung restoration is recreation, di ba? So kung anong nangyari nung creation, kung ano yung will ni God during the creation before Adam and Eve has fallen or yun din yung ganun din mangyayari sa restoration. absolute pa rin siya, yung God's will. So, mangyayari pa rin yung God's will. Ano ba yung God's will? So, that is the fulfillment of, and that human being must fulfill the three great blessings. So that, ano mangyayari? So that human beings and God uh, will build, will live happily in the kingdom of heaven on earth. So, ganun yung mangyayari. And then in section 2, sinabi dito na paano ba yung way of predestination na absolute, which is sinabi dito na yung God's responsibility is 95% and human portion of responsibility is 5%. So ibig sabihin, just like during the creation, prepare na ni God lahat ng mga kailangan mo in order to fulfill His will, di ba? You just need to fulfill yung 5% responsibility. You should yung individual perfection, family perfection, and perfection of dominion. Yun yun. So that maging happy lahat, si God and human beings. Pero yun yun. So ang gagawin na lang niya is to live, prepare niya yung lahat ng kailangan mo nandyan na. And ganun din sa restoration. Since pareho lang yung gagawin, di ba? Katulad, this time, may i-restore mo muna. Although, sabi nga natin, medyo mas mahirap kasi nga, nakita natin sa previous chapters na mas mahirap yung restoration process kasi nga, meron na tayong pinagbabayaran. Meron tayong pinagbabayaran at saka disconnected talaga. And then, ang palagi natin dapat tatandaan, Satan is always there to confuse us. Satan is always there to deceive us, just like what he did kina Adam and Eve. So, nandoon siya palagi. So, kung yun yung kung napagtagumpayan niya si Adam and Eve, sabi niya, syempre, doctorate degree na ako ngayon. Kayang-kaya ko din tong mga to, para ganyan. So, every now and then, yun yung gano'n. So, ano naman ngayon yung sa section 3? Predestination of human beings. So, anong pinag-uusapan dito? So, if a person does not complete his responsibility, he cannot become the person God has purposed him to be. Hence, predestination of human being is conditional. So, sinabi na yun kanina, predestination is conditional. Kasi pag hindi nga ginawa, just like Adam and Eve, they were not able to fulfill their responsibility na not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Hindi nila na-fulfill yon. Kaya yung fulfillment, yung God cannot, He cannot become the person purpose Him to be. So, hindi talaga sila talaga nag-mature at lumaking na maging anak ni God, kundi naging anak sila ni Satan, di ba? Ganun na yun. At kaya nga tayo under the dominion of Satan. So katulad din ng kwento ng sa second section na supposedly predestined niya na kakainin niya, matagal niyang binabantayan yung prutas na yun yung tawag dito, yung bayabas. Siguro hindi pa nga siya yung malapit ng mahinog, tingin niya malapit na ngang mahulog, hinihintay na lang niya na mahulog sa bibig niya. Meron pang kumuha ng iba. Kasi nga, ang responsibility niya is that, na lang niya aabutin na lang niya, di ba? And then, aabutin niya from the puno kasi kayang-kaya naman yung maabot yun. And then, ilagay sa bunganga niya, hindi para kainin niya, di ba? Pero hindi yun ang ginawa. Hinintay niya talagang mahulog para ma-shoot dun sa kanyang bibig para kagatin niya, di ba? Yun yung hinintay niya. So, hence, kaya siya conditional. Yun yung sinasabi, yung predestination of hindi mangyayari nung gusto ni God kung hindi ka makikipagtulungan. Katulad ng sinasabi natin na nasa Diyos ang awa, nasa tawang gawa. Yun. Kung wala kang ginagawa, paano maawa sa yung kahit naawa sa yung Diyos, kung wala naman ka namang ginagawa, wala talagang mangyayari, di ba? God providence of salvation begins with one point. Ano ibig sabihin ng one point? And gradually expand to cover the whole. Therefore, in the providence of salvation, God first predestined one person to be the central figure and then calls him to a mission. So yung one point na pinag-uusapan dito, yun yung kasi kailangan mo ng central figure. Tapos, yun yung central figure niya yon, siya yung magiging model ng lahat. Pero ano ba yung ng sa lahat? Pipili si God ng central figure and then siya yung magbibigay ng mission sa kanya para ma-fulfill yung predestination or yung God's will, di ba? Yung dinestined ni God na mangyari sa tao. So siya yung muna yung magfu-fulfill and then ito yung central figure na to, ituturo niya on how to fulfill each human being's portion of responsibility. Yun yung gagawin niya. Kaya nga siya yung model. Siya yung magiging role model. So ano yung qualification nung person na to? What qualification a person possess to merit such a calling? So, he must be born of the chosen people. Kailangan siya na maborn sa chosen people. Sa umpisa pa lang, even before Jesus Christ, di ba? Galing na saan ba nanggaling yung chosen people? Di ba? Sino bang mag-choose sa kanila? Di ba si God? So yung chosen people come from the predestined God from the descendants of Abraham. Di ba sinabi ni God kay Abraham nung tinawag niya siya, di ba? Si Abraham is anak ng Anak ng idol maker. Tapos tinawag niya, sumunod sa kanya, di ba? So nakita siguro matagal ng tawag dito, ino-observe ni God yan, and then sabi niya, nung napumunta siya sa isang lugar, nakalimutan ko anong tawag doon sa lugar na pupuntahan niya, tapos sumunod si Abraham sa kanya, tapos yun yung doon nanggaling yung chosen people, kasi prinamis ni God na yung kanyang mga descendants ay kasindami ng parang mga sand ba yun? Yung sand, parang ganyan. Hindi mo mabibilang yung kanyang descendants. Yun yung magiging chosen people. So, yun. So, he must choose. So, lahat ng central person mula kay Abraham, di ba? Galing dyan sa chosen people na yan. And even Jesus Christ comes from the chosen people. So, yun. He must be born in the chosen people. Next is he must come from ancestor line with good accomplishments. So, ano ba di ba? Sa New Testament, anong unang makikita mo dun makikita natin sa New Testament, di ba? Sa Book of Matthew ba? Yun ba una sa New Testament? So, ang makikita nyo dun, yung, tama? Ano, sir? Ang makikita nyo yung genealogy ni Jesus Christ. Di ba? Kung ano yung genealogy niya, pag makikita nyo from yung history ng actually yun yung kung saan nanggaling si Virgin Mary, di ba? Yung lineage ni Virgin Mary yung makikita eh. Merong isang nakalimutan ko kung ano yung isang na meron din yung lineage ni Joseph. Pero yung karamihan doon, yung dalawa doon na hindi nakalimutan ko na kung anong book 'yon. Tatlo kasi sila. Tapos yung dalawa doon, ang nakalagay yung lineage ni Mary. Wherein kung susundan mo lahat 'yon, makikita mo na galing talaga sa good lineage and good accomplishment yung mga parang sinasabi si ganito, tatay niya si ganito, ganon. Sinasabi niya ay anak niya, naging anak niya, tapos ganito. Parang sinasabi niya ganon. Pero pag titignan mo sa pagkakasulat sa Bible, makikita mo na galing talaga sila sa good accomplishment. Katulad din ng sa Completed Testament age, pag makikita nyo din, si mother and father, makikita din sa autobiography nila na galing talaga sa mga good people of good accomplishment. Yung lineage ni father at saka si mother, kung mabasa niyo yung autobiography nila. As well as pareho yung si father and mother is galing din sila sa chosen people kasi di ba alam naman natin na meron talagang tawag dito yung sa history nila na magiging chosen people sila. Kung alam masyado yung term. So galing sila doon. And then next is requisite, they must possess, he must be endowed with the requisite character. Ibig sabihin, yung meron dapat siyang character na kapareho yung character dapat na sinasabi dun sa God's will or dun sa blueprint ni Heavenly Father, which is dapat kapareho siya nung ugali, yung nature and personality ni God. May ganun siyang character. Kasi 'di ba, man is siya yung create niya tayo in his image para ma-inherit natin lahat yung in our growing period ma-inherit natin yung character ni God, nature and character ni Heavenly Father. And fourth, we must develop the necessary qualities during his early life. So, makikita natin, anong example natin? So, makikita natin, kay Jesus Christ din, di ba? In His early life, makikita na natin na talagang nung nawala siya. Nung nawala siya, di ba? Nasaan siya pumunta? Doon, nagturo siya doon sa di ba? Nagturo siya saan siya nakita? Doon sa temple. Nagtuturo siya, di ba? Nag-i-speech siya. Kung sa panahon ni Father, nag-i-speech siya doon. Nagtuturo siya sa salita ni God. Ganon din si yung necessary qualities na dinevelop din ng yung inherently parang nakalagay sa DNA nila kahit si mother and father nung mga bata pa sila na dinidevelop na nila yung qualities, yung mga necessary qualities para maging true parents nung mga bata pa sila, di ba? Pag babasahin niyo yung kanilang autobiography, makikita niyo doon. Just like si father, talagang nung bata pa siya, talagang nagtatanggol na siya ng mga ng mga ibang bata, 'di ba? Kahit mas maliit sa kanya ay mas malaki sa kanya, pinagtatanggol niya yung mga inaapi. Tapos nung bata pa siya, nung mas earlier pa siya, talagang tinitignan na niya yung ino-observe niya yung mga animals, 'di ba? Kung paano yung way of life ng animals kasi yun din yung nagturo kay Father kung paano yung love, ganun, paano pinapangalagaan nung mga ibon yung kanyang mga mga inakay, yun yung mga ganon. Nakikita niya yon. So, ganun sila, ganun nila dinevelop yung mga sarili nila sa early life pa lang nila. And fifth, he must live in a time and place most fitting to God's need. So dapat uh, yung ano na yan, yung central person na yan must live in a time and place most fitting to God's need. Kasi 'di ba katulad ni Abraham, supposedly 'di ba, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Panahon ni Jacob dapat okay na ay supposedly pwede na sana dahil na-restore na, pero hindi pa ano 'di ba, hindi pa siya uh, time. Kasi konti pa lang yata sila. Ay, basta hindi ko masyadong matandaan kung bakit hindi pa siya time. So na dumating yung Messiah at that time. So dapat uh, dumating siya sa most fitting time sa God's need. Yung na-prepare na lahat yung mayroon ng foundation dapat. So that's the end of section 3.
Thank you po. Okay, thank you po Ate Regina. So, yun po yung mga qualities ng central figure. So, actually tayo po, mga central figures din po tayo this time in our ancestors. Anyway, next, ito na talaga to. Section 4 of Predestination. Let's welcome our Kuya Herwin. Ate Jen.
Nakikita ba? Tanga. Give me 1 second. Hindi pala 1 second. Okay. Good evening. Good evening, brothers and sisters. I want to hear an answer from brothers and
Good
sisters.
evening.
Good evening.
Good evening po.
Good evening po.
Good evening. Thank you. So, predestination, parang mabilis tayo matapos ito. Yeah, this topic is very short, like with the other chapters. But, yeah. So far we have discussed various issues concerning this predestination from section 1, the fulfillment of God's will, and section 2, how it would be fulfilled, and section 3, predestination of human beings. And now we are here in this chapter 4, section 4, I mean, sorry, not chapter. Section 4, elucidation of biblical verses, which supports the doctrine of absolute predestination. So these are just some like verse verses that we have to clearly understand. Because some of the Christians, even other religions, misinterpret the word predestination. And even one of the, I know you know this person, maybe John Calvin, the Christian, and he emphasizes that the predestination of human beings, of God to human beings, is absolute, wherein human beings only depends on God. But let's see, in the unification principle, Father taught this, share this to us, that is it really, is it this, yeah, already explained other sections, but this is an additional verses, Bible verses. So from Romans chapter 8, verse 29 to 30, says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. So if we understand the Bible, this one verse Bible, without knowing the principle, I think, yeah, the other Christians that they're based on their interpretation, it can be that God solely take responsibility for the predestination of human beings. From this verse, ang intindi nila is si God ang may hawak ng lahat. Ah, lahat ng nangyayari sa buhay natin. Kasi nga sabi, God is omniscient, so he knew before, he foreknew, then we are predestined by God and we are called by God, and he also justified us and he also glorified us. That's the literal meaning of this verse. But in the unification principle, the Father teach this to us because everybody here already a member of the unification. So this this verse doesn't mention human portion of responsibility, as I've tackled already in the other section. That we have the 5% portion of responsibility and God has 95% of responsibility. And if these two will work together, then the fulfillment of the purpose of creation will be established here on earth. So God predestines those whom he foreknows, then he calls upon him to fulfill the purpose of the providence. Calling the person is God's responsibility, but only when the person completes his responsibility after being called by God is he justified and then glorified. So this one never mentions in any other verse in the Bible, but in the unification principle, true Father plainly explained to us that God's calling for human beings is his predestination to human beings. Calling upon the person to become a central figure to fulfill the purpose of creation is God's responsibility. But yun nga, if you are called by God, it doesn't mean that you are you're already being justified, it means that if you're being called by God, kung tinawag ka nila God, hindi ibig sabihin na justified ka na, then glorified. It doesn't mean like that. Ang ibig sabihin yan, pag tinawag ka ni God, you have the responsibility in order for you that God will be able to justify for you, and then you will be glorified also by God. So it is human portion of responsibility already mentioned in the sections before this section 4, if you understood already. Because the biblical verse does not mention the human portion of responsibility. It doesn't mention the human portion of responsibility. People may misinterpret it to mean that all affairs are determined solely by God's absolute predestination. So, yeah. But now, we all knew that we have human portion of responsibility, and then we have God's responsibility. So, maniwala ba kayo na lahat ng bagay is because God's will? Yung mga naghihirap na tao, God's will ba yun? Kawawa naman sila. Kung ikaw parent sa hayaan mo lang ba yung mga anak mo? Is it God's will? Right? Kung nag-drive ka, tapos lasing ka, tapos nabangga ka, namatay, is it God's will?
No.
Lasing ka? Absolutely no. Kasi kung hindi ka lasing, hindi ka mabangga. The point here is the biggest yung hinahawakan natin is responsibility. 5% lang siya, but it took 100% of effort of human beings. But for us, it's really hard. But this is what we need to do so that we can fulfill the purpose of God, the purpose of creation, the triggered blessings, and to establish the kingdom of heaven here on earth. So, if we look back in our life before, and then kung titingnan natin actually yung life natin before we met the movement, and then the time that we met the movement, there are some instances that why it is happened. Na supposed to be, I should go there, but then may nag-approach sa akin na ganito, di ba yung principal, na lecturean or ganon. And then why it happened? Kasi dito kasi sa HQ, lahat na meron kami ditong testimony. Lahat ng staff testimony sa life nila, so that we will all know our background and we can be able to understand each other, relate each other, and also help one another to change something. So then while I'm listening to them, when we finish our testimony, then I realized that every time they share their testimony, it took 2 hours actually. Actually, if you're sharing your testimony, I think whole day is not enough. It takes very long, but very short time. But at that very short time, of giving testimony, na-realize ko na parang lahat kami ba, destined talaga ni God na ma-meet yung movement. That we are the central figure in our lineage. Basta, ang hirap i-explain eh. I know, kahit pabigyan ko ba kayo ng testimony ngayon, I can really testify that coming here, meeting the movement is really predestined by God. And now the question is, how to be justified by God? And it is the human portion responsibility. We are being called by God, ano yung gagawin natin? And especially now, Kasi mga blessing candidates din kayo, then matching candidates. So, calling here is already, we are taking a responsibility already. Kasi calling pa lang meeting the movement is God's responsibility. Now, being here, you are doing the 5% portion of responsibility. Receiving your spouse, that's God's responsibility. The question is, are you ready to receive your spouse? Are you qualified? Did you do ginawa mo ba yung responsibility mo? Ano yung mga condition na ginawa mo? Binago mo ba yung character? Binago ba yung character natin? Individually para masabihin naman para naman pagdating spouse natin, ano na, matching na karapat dapat ako para sa kanya. Para mo naman masabi natin, pero usually, hindi natin masabi ng ganun. It's because all of us are not qualified, but we still have this responsibility na be qualified really in front of God. And that is our responsibility. So I hope na this chapter, Predestination, ito yung human portion of responsibility talaga, ito yung talaga yung pinakamalaking yung sa lahat-lahat talaga. Pag wala kang ginagawa, sabi nga kay, natawa ako sa video kanina, ang galing natin mo na si Juan walang ginagawa, Juan tamad, sikat na sikat. Kung wala kang ginagawa, makuha talaga sa iba yung blessing. Yes, actually, for sure, God will choose another person to receive this kind of blessing. If you are not ready, actually, God already preparing for you, but it is just, kayo lang actually ang hinaantay. Kasi bakit? Nag-attend pa kayo ng 21 days. Bilisan natin okay? Bilisan natin yung 21 days. Ilan na, malapit na. So wag na kayong magtaka kung after ng 21 days, makaka-receive na kayo ng yung mas sa inyo, okay? So yun nga guys, if we take this seriously actually, kasi nga ako based on my experience, based on our experience, before we will, yun nga, but I will share that later. Yeah. Anyway, predestination, do we have this determination to fulfill our responsibility? And do we really understood God's heart so that we could be able to do our best and to help God to heal this painful heart? Meron ba tayong ganun? Oo naman si God pag walang nag-iisip ng ganun ba? Sa mga anak niya ba? Tapos walang nag-iisip na, how can I help God to heal his painful heart? How can I help God na ma-establish yung kingdom of heaven here on earth? Kung pag-receive pa lang ng blessing, i-reject ko na agad. Masasaksak pag si God yan kasi inano na ni God yung blessing tapos umayaw ka. God, ayaw ko ng ganun. Tahimik lang si God pero umayak siya inside. The point is, we have to do our responsibility and help God for the providence. Aju, so much more for that. Thank you very much.